I want to tell you a story about the Reformation. It's Pastor Brian Wolfmueller here, and we all know the famous stuff. Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the castle church door in Wittenberg. What are you doing, these guys are saying. Or Luther standing up at the Diet of Worms. Here I stand, I can do no other. Unless I'm convinced by Scripture and clear reason, I cannot recant, and so forth. Look, he threw his books on the ground. There's Emperor Charles V. Those are the big things, but look, underneath it, there was a silent event that happened. Martin Luther's tower discovery. Do you see how that was meaningful, how I uncovered? Martin Luther's tower discovery, his discovery of the gospel. I want to tell you that story today because this is really perhaps one of the key, although quiet moments of the Reformation. Now, here's where it was. Martin Luther was he was born in 1483, and he died in 1546. And at the end of his life, right before, in 1545, they published an edition of his Latin works, and they asked Luther when they published that, if he would write a preface for it, and he did. And in that preface, he went back and he talked about the events surrounding the beginning of the Reformation. He was a lecturer at Wittenberg in 1511, and remember, he nailed the 95 Theses. In 1517, he was writing letters to the popes, and so he's telling the story. He was also in those days lecturing on the book of Romans and the book of Psalms, and that's going to be the key. Now, this all happened in Wittenberg. Luther lived in the Augustinian monastery there in Wittenberg. He was ordained in Erfurt, but he moved over there to Wittenberg, and he was a professor, and he was teaching. And it's probably in this time, right around the year 1517, 1518, maybe 1516 or so, that he was having trouble. And so he writes in his own words what was going on. He says, "Meanwhile, I had already during that year," so again, maybe this year is 1516, anywhere between 1516 to 1518, right in this time frame. You can't pin it down exactly. "I returned to interpret the Psalter anew." The Psalter is the book of Psalms. "I had confidence in the fact that I was more skillful after I had lectured in the University of Wittenberg University, on St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, to the Galatians, and the one to the Hebrews. I had indeed been captivated with an extraordinary ardor for understanding Paul in the epistle to the Romans. But, he says, he was stuck. Up till then, it was not the cold blood about the heart, but a single word in chapter 1, verse 17. In it," now this is key here, "in it," that is, in the gospel, "the righteousness of God is revealed." So here's Luther teaching, and he's teaching about these things, and he has so much trouble with that word, the righteousness of God. In fact, look what he says. This is always kind of astonishing for me to read. He says, that word, the righteousness of God, stood in my way, for I hated that word." Look at that. "I hated that word, the righteousness of God, which according to the use and custom of all the teachers, I had been taught to understand philosophically regarding the formal or active righteousness, as they called it, with which God is righteous and punishes the unrighteous sinner." So how did Luther understand this word, the righteousness of God? He understood that really there was a righteousness of the law, and that was unfolded in the Ten Commandments. This said that you shouldn't love any other gods, you shouldn't fear any other gods or have any other gods, you should love your neighbor as yourself, and so forth. And this was for the normal guy. This was for the normal person. This is for the everyday Christian. That was the requirements there. But then there was a righteousness of the gospel that was even more severe. It was the righteousness especially for the holy people or for the monks. And remember, the monks took a threefold vow: a vow of poverty, a vow of chastity, and a vow of obedience to the order that they were in. So, for example, the Augustinian order or something like this. In other words, that there was a normal and then that there was a higher righteousness of the gospel. And this was the business of being a monk. Here's Luther with his monk's haircut. See that? Now, where did this come from? If you want an example of it, you find it in the medieval treatment on the Sermon on the Mount. You remember that Jesus said, "You have heard it said before that you shall not murder. But I say to you that if you're angry in your heart, or if you call your brother Raka, fool, then you've murdered him. Or you've heard it said before, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that if you look at a woman with lust, you've committed adultery in her heart." Well, the medieval church treated this as two different kinds of righteousnesses. You had the external righteousness of the Ten Commandments, which is for the normal people. And then over here, you had the evangelical counsels. That was their name for it. And that is the righteousness of the gospel that was taken upon the monks and the spiritual to live a more holy and a more perfect life. So that they didn't understand the "you shall not murder" and "don't be angry" as an amplification of the law of God, but rather they understood it to be sort of two separate standards, one for the everyday Joe and one for the spiritual, the monks and nuns and so forth. And so Luther understood that the righteousness of God that Paul was talking about was this kind of righteousness, the more demanding righteousness that God was requiring. Now you got to picture it like this. Imagine here you are, a poor sinner, and you're like, you're carrying along the Ten Commandments, and then God comes on and he adds even more to it, so that now you're just being crushed by the weight of this double law. And Luther saw all of that by understanding this business here as the righteousness of the gospel. And look at what he says about it. He said, "I hated that word, the righteousness of God." And he goes on to say, look at this. "Though I lived as a monk without reproach, I felt that I was a sinner before God with an extremely disturbed conscience. And I could not believe that he was placated by my satisfaction. Even though he was doing all these different things, he knew that God could not possibly be happy with him. I did not love, yes, I hated the righteous God who punishes sinners." And look, you saw that Luther hated the word. Now he hated the God who demanded so much. "And secretly, if not blasphemously, certainly murmuring greatly, I was angry with God and said, as if it is not enough that miserable sinners eternally lost through original sin are crushed by every kind of calamity by the law of the Decalogue," that's the Ten Commandments, Deca, 10, log, words, the Ten Commandments, "without having God add pain to pain by the gospel." Again, you got it, see? It's the Ten Commandments are weighing you down, and the gospel is even more. It's the gospel, understood, is this intensification of God's law, and by the gospel threatening us with his righteousness and wrath. "Thus I raged with a fierce and troubled conscience. Nevertheless, I beat inopportunely upon St. Paul at that place," Romans 1:17, 16 through 18, "most ardently desiring to know what St. Paul wanted." And here's where the big event is going to occur. Here's, again, Luther in his own words. Now, what I want you to notice is that Luther is not going to say that I have a vision or a dream or angels came and spoke to me. Look what he says. "At last, by the mercy of God, meditating day and night, I gave heed to the context." Luther does not say that this particular insight into the gospel came through his own efforts, through his own understanding, or through some sort of divine intervention, but simply that he paid attention to the context, to what Paul was talking about, and look at what he found in the context. Namely, in it, the righteousness of God is revealed, as it is written, "He who through faith is righteous shall live." So that Luther notices that right next to this word, the righteousness of God, is the word faith. Now, here's why that's so important. Because Luther knows that there's a difference between faith and works. Faith after all, is how you keep a promise. If I give you a promise, it is for you to believe and for you to trust in. Works, on the other hand, are how you keep a command. So that if I give you something to do, you keep it by doing it, by accomplishing it, by doing a particular work. And Luther notices that the righteousness of God that's promised in the gospel is the righteousness not of works and obedience, but rather the righteousness of faith, the righteousness of promise. So that this righteousness is a promised righteousness, not a commanded righteousness, not an accomplished righteousness, not a righteousness of our own, worked by our own efforts, but rather the promise of God, which comes to us as a free and perfect gift. So that Luther now understands that the righteousness that Paul is talking about in Romans 1 is not the righteousness of the law, but the righteousness of the gospel, that is, the righteousness of the promise, the righteousness that we have by faith. Blam, that's it. That's the moment when Luther understands that this comes as a gift. And look at what he says. There I began to understand that the righteousness of God is that by which the righteous lives by a gift of God, namely by faith. And this is the meaning. The righteousness of God is revealed by the gospel, namely the passive righteousness, not active righteousness. Luther would write around this time, he would write a sermon called The Two Kinds of Righteousness. And he'll talk about a lot of different kinds of righteousnesses, in fact, 3, 4, 5 different kinds of righteousness. But the two kinds of righteousness basically breaks down to this. You have active righteousness and you have passive righteousness. Active righteousness is that which we do in accordance with the law, and passive righteousness is that which we have as a gift from the gospel, apart, and this is the key, apart, distinct from the law and from our works. The passive righteousness with which merciful God justifies us by faith, as it is written, "He who through faith is righteous shall live." Here I felt, now look what happens when Luther sees this. Here I felt that I was altogether born again and had entered paradise itself through open gates. There a totally other face of the entire Scripture showed itself to me. This is the faith of what we now call the gospel, the promise, the gift. Thereupon I ran through the Scriptures from memory. I also found in other terms an analogy. The work of God, that is what God does in us. The power of God, which He makes us strong. The wisdom of God, with which He makes us wise. The strength of God, the salvation of God, the glory of God, and so forth and so on. The scales had fallen off of his eyes, and he saw the gospel truly for the first time. And look at how it ends. This is absolutely beautiful. So I extolled my sweetest word with a love as great as the hatred with which I had hated before, the word, the righteousness of God. Thus that place in Paul was for me truly the gate to paradise. To understand that the righteousness of God is not the righteousness which is demanded, but the righteousness which is given. And it's not the righteousness which is achieved by our efforts, but a righteousness that is received by faith. And that this is what it means to be justified, to be declared holy and righteous in the sight of God. Luther saw it right there in the words. And after that, there's no going back. I mean, they can come and say, Luther, look, you recant, and how can he? We're going to cut off your head. We're going to burn you at the stake. What? So what? He has the word, the righteousness of God. And he has that righteousness of God. And dear friends, we have it too. So that's the little quiet event that really moved the Reformation. Thanks be to God.